There were once upon a time 3 sisters who lived in an old, high stone house in a street not far from the great square of the city where was the palace of the king. The 2 eldest of these sisters were old and ugly, which is bad enough. They were also sour and jealous, which was worse. And simply because the youngest, who was only their half-sister, was gentle and lovely, they hated her. While they themselves sat in comfort in their fine rooms upstairs, she was made to live in a dark, stone-flagged kitchen with nothing but rats, mice, and cockroaches for company. There, in a kind of cupboard, cooking and scrubbing and sweeping and scouring, she made the beds, washed their linen, darned their stockings, mended their clothes. She was never in bed till midnight. In summer or winter, she had to be up every morning at 5 to fetch water, to chop up the firewood, and light the fires. In the blind, frozen mornings of winter, she could scarcely creep about from the cold. Yet, in spite of all this, though she hadn't enough to eat, though her sisters never worried of nagging and scolding her, or of beating her either when they felt in the humor, she soon forgot their tongues and bruises. She must have been happy by nature. Just as by nature a may tree covered with leaves and blossom, or water jets out of a wellspring. To catch sight of a sunbeam lighting up the kitchen wall now and then, or the moonlight stealing across the floor, or merely to wake and hear the birds shrilling at daybreak, was enough to set her heart on fire. She would jump out of bed, say her prayers, slip into her rags, wash her bright face under the pump, comb her dark hair, then, singing too, not like the birds, but softly, under her breath, she would begin her work. Sometimes she would set herself races against the old kitchen clock, or say to herself, "When this is done, and this and this and this and this, I'll look out of the window." However late it was before the day was finished, she made it a rule to always sit for a little while in front of the great kitchen fire, her stool drawn close up to the hearth among the cinders. There she would begin to dream even before she fell asleep, and in mockery her sisters called her Cinderella. They never left her at peace. If they could not find work for her to do, they made it, and for food they gave her their crusts and bits left over. They hated her, and hated her all the more because, in spite of their scowls and grumblings, she never stayed mumpish or sulky, while her cheeks ever grew fairer and her eyes brighter. She couldn't help it. Since she felt young and happy, she couldn't but seem so. Now all this may have been in part because Cinderella had a fairy godmother. This fairy godmother had come to her christening, and well the sisters remembered it. This little bunched-up old woman had a hump in her back, was dressed in outlandish clothes and a high steeple hat, and the 2 impudent trollops, who even then tried to make themselves look older than they were, had called her Old Stump Stump, had put out their tongues at her and laughed at every word she said. But except for one slow, piercing look at them out of her green eyes, after which they'd laugh no more, the old woman had paid them no heed. She had stooped over Cinderella's wooden cradle and gazed a long time at her sleeping face. Then, laying a skinny forefinger on the mite's chin, had slowly nodded. Once, twice, thrice. If every nod meant a fairy gift, then what wonder Cinderella had cheeks like the wild rose, eyes as clear as dewdrops, and a tongue like a blackbird's. Now, Cinderella, of course, could not remember her christening, and her godmother had never been seen or heard of since. She seemed to have quite forgotten her godchild, and one day Cinderella spoke of her to her sisters, who were beside themselves with rage. godmother, forsooth, they cackled. Crazy old humpback. Much she cares for you, Miss Slut. Keep to your cinders, and no more drowsing and dreaming by the fire. So time went on, until at last Cinderella was so used to their pinchings and beatings and scoldings that she hardly noticed them. She kept out of their company as much as she could, almost forgot how to cry, was happy when she was alone, and was never idle. Now, a little before Christmas, in the year when Cinderella was 18, the king sent out his trumpeters to proclaim that on 12th night there was to be a great ball at the palace, with such dancing and feasting and revelry as had never been known in that country before. Bonfires were to be lit on the hills, torches in the streets. There were to be stalls of hot pies, eels, sweetmeats, cakes, and comfits in the marketplace. There were to be booths showing strange animals and birds and such like. And the fountains in the city were to run that night with wine, for the next day after it would be the 21st birthday of the king's only son. When the people heard the proclamation of the king's trumpeters, there were wild rejoicings, and they at once began to make ready for the feast. In due time there came to the old stone house where the three sisters lived the king's lord chamberlain. At the sound of wheels of his coach, the two elder sisters squinted down out of their window, and then at once scuttled downstairs to lock Cinderella in the kitchen, in case he should see not only her rags, but her lovely young face. He had come, as they guessed, to bring them the king's command, and that they should attend the king's great ball. I see, madame, 3 are invited, he said, looking at his scroll. Aye, they said, as if in grief. But only 2 of us are left. So he bowed and withdrew. After that, the 2 old sisters scarcely stopped talking about the ball. They could think of nothing else. They spent the whole day, and every day, in turning out their chests and wardrobes in search of whatever bit of finery they could lay hands on. For hours together they sat in front of their great looking-glass, smirking this way and languishing that, trying on any old gown or cloak they could find. Slippers and sashes, wigs and laces and buckles and necklaces, and never of the same mind for 2 minutes together. And when they weren't storming at Cinderella, they were quarreling and wrangling between themselves. As for Cinderella, from mornings to nights she sat stitching and stitching till she could scarcely see out of her young eyes or hold her needle. The harder she worked and the more she tried to please them, the worse they fumed and flustered. They were like wasps in a trap. At last came the night of the ball. The streets were ablaze with torches and bonfires. In every window burned wax tapers. Shawls and silks of all colors of the rainbow dangled from sill and balcony. Wine red and gold gushed from the fountains. Everywhere was feasting and merriment, laughter and music. At one end of the city there was a booth of traveling bears, which soon were so crammed with buns and honeycomb they could only sit and pant. And at the other was a troop of Barbary apes that played on every kind of instrument of music. Besides which, there was a singing mermaid, a giant with a dwarf on his hat brim, and a wild man from the Indies that gulped down flaming pitch as if it were milk and water. The country people, in all their best and gayest clothes, and they came from as far and near as if to a fair, had brought their children, even to the youngest, and stood gazing and gaping at the dressed-up lords and ladies in their coaches and carriages on their way to the palace. There were coaches with 6 horses, and coaches with 4, and a fat, furred, scarlet-silked postillion to each pair. The whole city, under the tent of the starry night, flared bright as a peep-show. But Cinderella hadn't a moment even to peer down from an upper window to see these wonders. She hardly knew whether she was on her head or her heels. And when at last the 2 old sisters, looking in their wigs and powder, more like bunched up fantastic monkeys than human beings, had at last rolled off in their hired carriage to the palace, she was so tired she could scarcely creep upstairs. After tidying up the litter in their bedrooms and making a pot of soup to be kept simmering for them until they came home, She drew up her stool to the kitchen fire, with not even the heart to look out of the window. She had never before felt so lonely or wretched, and as she sat there looking at the red glow of the smoldering coals, even before she knew it was there, a tear rolled down from her cheek and splashed with a sizzle into the hot ashes. She ached all over. Nevertheless, she poked up the fire again, swept up the ashes, began to sing a little to herself, forgot to go on, and as she did so, set to wondering what she would be doing now if she herself had gone to the palace. "But since you can't be in two places, my dear," she suddenly laughed out loud, "why, here you must stay."